Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and having a chat with Ben Dattner. I'm really happy and proud to introduce him. Back in 1995, he and I were two of the four incoming excited students at NYU's IO Psychology, Industrial Organizational Psychology PhD program. So we've known each other for a very long time. And I remember for as long as I've known Ben, he's been interested in how we kind of warp reality to meet our needs. And I remember your dissertation was actually on narcissists and whether narcissists have a different perception of what they do and whether it's perceived as fair than the people who report up into a narcissist. So I actually wasn't surprised when I heard about this book, which is The Blame Game, all about how we assign credit and dole out blame for the things that happen in the workplace. So very eager to hear what you have to say, Ben, and welcome to Google.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for anybody who's curious, Brian's dissertation was about nepotism. And we used to joke about what is the term, is it a nepot for a man and a nepota for a woman? We never actually came to a consensus. So thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here. I credit Google for my ability to write this book because my co-author and I, Darren Dahl, used Google every day for everything that we did when it came to the book. Whether it was hunting down an article, whether it was hunting down research, whether it was looking for famous people, whatever it may be, famous stories, we used Google all the time. And it is interesting in today's world who gets credit and blame for things. I'm sure you're all thinking about news and news aggregation, what's paid for and what's free, what's linked to what makes your profile higher or lower on Google and what that means. So we'll be thinking about that as we move forward. So as Brian mentioned, I'm an organizational psychologist, as is he. I'm very impressed by the work that you guys are doing here when it comes to people analytics. And luckily, Google is an organization that already has in mind the kinds of errors and biases people make. When it comes to assessing performance, there was that great New York Times article a couple of weeks ago about people analytics at Google and how you're given cues when you, for example, fill out a performance appraisal form. Keep in mind the recency effect, the primacy effect, the halo effect. So this is an organization that already has those things in mind. So why credit and blame? Why did I write this book? Well, as I work as an organizational psychologist, I work with individuals and teams in organizations large and small, for-profit and not-for-profit in the US and abroad. And what I find is regardless of what I'm doing, whether it's working with an individual, doing conflict resolution between two individuals, facilitating the work of a team, or facilitating the work between teams, credit and blame is where everybody's energy is. Who's being credited? Who's being blamed? Is it fair? Is it not fair? Is it accurate? Is it not accurate? Is it helpful or is it not helpful? And in the work that I do, I'm not able to be helpful to an individual pair of people, team, or organization without challenging notions of credit and blame, the narratives of credit and blame. Who's getting the credit? Who's getting the blame? Because of our hardwiring as a species, because of each of our individual early life experiences, it's very rare that we credit people for the same reasons at the same time in the same way. Each of us comes to work each day with the legacy of our own families, our own culture, our own gender, and that impacts how we credit and blame ourselves and others. And the book is really about how credit and blame is not just an effect of organizational behavior, it's actually a cause of organizational behavior. So it's not that organizational triumph or tragedy happens and then credit and blame result. What the book does is it flips it around and says, what about the patterns of credit and blame that set the groundwork, that lay the foundation for success or failure? Hence the subtitle of the book, How the Rules of Credit and Blame Determine Our Success or Failure. So the book starts out by looking at why blame is so important. And it works at every level of analysis. So an individual in his or her career is going to be thinking, how much credit do I deserve for my accomplishments on a team? How much blame do I deserve when things go wrong? And even starting there, people tend to take and claim more credit for themselves and their own contributions and accomplishments than others would give them. So if you ask members of a team, for example, what proportion of the team's accomplishments or results were you personally responsible for? If you ask 10 people on the team, they'll each say, 20%, 30%, 40%, 80%, whatever it may be. And if you add up those numbers, it'll add up to far more than 100%. It's a little bit like the fictional shares in the Broadway show and the movie The Producers, where they sell more shares than there actually are. And so credit and blame, everybody, we have self-serving biases. We have a lot more information about what we've done and what we've contributed than we do about what other people have done and what they have contributed. So part of it's an informational thing. We have much more information about ourselves and our hard work, but part of it's also a bias thing and a motivational thing, which is we are motivated to overestimate our own contributions and to underestimate those of others. And these dynamics and these self-serving biases soon cascade up within relationships, within and between teams, and in entire organizational cultures. So in the introduction to the book, I talk about the proverbial 6 phases of a project. Is anybody familiar with those? The 6 phases are, and I don't know whether it's applicable here or not, are enthusiasm, disillusionment, panic, search for the guilty, punishment of the innocent, and then rewards for those who had nothing to do with it. And so even though we studied many formal academic models of credit and blame over the course of our academic and professional careers, it's rare, in my experience, that a project doesn't at least have some of those attributes as it winds its way from conception to completion. People care too much and they suboptimize. If there's one lesson in people's careers, and the Center for Creative Leadership, where I'm an affiliate, has done longitudinal research about what makes people successful over the course of their careers, it's tempting to take credit in the short term, to overestimate your contributions and your talents. But it's actually quite harmful over the longer term. And people who are unrepentant, unremitting self-creditors have a problem. First of all, they're going to be resented by their coworkers and colleagues. But second of all, if they take credit for everything, they're not going to learn. They're not going to take feedback. They're going to have a fixed view of their own capabilities rather than to take a learning approach. And so how you manage credit and blame for yourself and others is a key determinant of career success, regardless of the size of your organization. And so it's important as you go through your career to think about, how am I taking credit and blame? Is it fair? Is it accurate? As I mentioned before, people tend to sub-optimize. People fight too hard to get credit that they think they deserve, but that other people don't necessarily think they deserve. And when we feel blamed, we tend to work too hard to get exonerated of that blame. And like many other things in life and work, the underlying issue, the underlying contribution that you did or didn't make, or mistake you did or didn't make, is often much less important than what you do about it afterwards. So if you're working on a project and you feel undercredited, that may or may not make a difference. But if you fight so hard to get the credit that you anger everybody around you, you might end up, they might say, okay, it was you who did that, but now I don't want to work with you anymore. Now, you're unpleasant as a colleague and collaborator. And similarly, you might push so hard to be exonerated of a minor mistake or oversight. First of all, doing that might mean that you have to then blame someone else. So one of the lessons of this book is not to rush to judgment, not to act impulsively, but instead to sort of think in a more mindful way about credit and blame, to make sure that you're acting in a self-serving way, in a positive sense of self-serving, not in a biased manner. So as the world changes, and this is an organization that's at the vanguard of those changes, the world is much less about centralized bureaucracies and centralized notions of credit and blame. It's much more about networks and information and less hierarchical, more horizontal notions of information and linkages between things. One of the things I've heard about Google is that in hiring people here, there's a resonance, and there often is with the companies that I consult to, that there's something about the fundamental nature of the company that gets enacted. It's almost like a work of literature in which every little passage reflects the whole. What I've heard is that the hiring process is a little bit analogous to doing a Google search. People link to you, you're credible, there's some secret algorithm, some secret sauce that determines whether you get hired or not. And so in essence, that's a kind of avant-garde, world-changing world kind of credit and blame, which is, your Google rankings, how you get hired, etc., is all part of the new world of credit and blame. So the first chapter is about evolution. And even starting with our primate relatives, I tell the story of Coco the gorilla, who lives in California. I don't know how far from your headquarters, but she learned several thousand words of sign language, and she's monitored 24 hours a day. She's one of the few characters in the book who is identified by her real name. I hope she doesn't mind. And so one night, Coco was playing with a toy cat, and she accidentally broke it. And the next morning, her morning attendant came in and signed to her what happened to the cat. And Coco signed, "It was my nighttime attendant who broke the cat." So even our gorilla relatives have a notion of credit and blame and are able to literally point the finger at someone else. I also, from the evolutionary point of view, tell the story of capuchin monkeys. Brian and I, when we were in grad school, had to study equity theory, which was developed by John Stacey Adams in the 60s, where he said what workers do is they compare their inputs with their outputs with their coworkers' inputs and outputs. And it turns out that capuchin monkeys do the same thing. So if you have a monkey pulling a bar and you're giving him a cucumber reward, he will happily pull that bar and continue participating in the experiment. If you put another capuchin monkey in an adjacent cage where they can see each other but not touch or directly interact, and if you give that second monkey a grape for doing the same task, the first monkey will become totally indignant and enraged and actually go so far as to throw the cucumber back at the researcher because they have a notion of fairness and they say, "I'm pulling this lever, I'm just getting cucumber, you're doing the same thing, you're getting grape." And so the same is true in the workplace. We look at our inputs and outputs, and if our coworkers' ratios of inputs to outputs are unfavorable to us, we can act and react in an impulsive, primate, emotional, hardwiring kind of way. The interesting thing about this, though, is that when you think of the four notions, the four variables in this equation, our inputs, our outputs, your outputs, all four of those things are subjective. What my inputs really are, what my outputs really are. I mean, outputs in terms of salary or promotions or visibility might be concrete, but each of us, because of our social wiring, we have many more subtle notions of outputs, which is the esteem in which we're held by colleagues, the likelihood that we may advance in the organization. And in that Great Times article about Google, you looked at what were the people analytics team looked at what were the factors that made people successful. And I don't know, did you look at credit and blame? Your next assignment, area for future research could be how people handle credit and blame. I would imagine, though, the sort of emotional skills, managerial skills, leadership skills, I would imagine credit and blame is somewhere therein. So any questions about the evolutionary perspective on credit and blame? Okay. So in chapter 1, I also talk about stereotyping, which is we have automatic pre-conscious notions of credit and blame. And in the book, and also in a Harvard Business Review article that's out this month, I have a link to the implicit associations test, which is run through Harvard, where you can look at people from different ethnicities, genders, races, backgrounds, etc. And the test assesses how quick are you to make associations between positive words and members of one group and between negative words and members of other groups. And what the research shows is that no matter how enlightened and equal opportunity we believe ourselves to be, it still may be easier for us to make an association between a Caucasian face and a positive word and a member of an ethnic minority and a negative word simply because of our socialization, our acculturation, because of our exposure in the media. And so it's good to know the first step to overcoming these things, which I think people of goodwill want to do, is judge people, as Martin Luther King said, by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. being aware of your biases so that you can correct for those biases is something that's very important. And I know when it comes to Google and searching, there's been stuff in the news recently about search results, what qualifies as a good search result, what's includable, what's not includable. So that's an interesting kind of credit and blame that you all work with as well. The book is about also people shooting the messenger, that we tend to develop negative associations and tend to scapegoat people who threaten our worldview, who threaten organizational paradigms. And this has nothing to do with people's merit, but instead it has to do with how they're perceived, how much anxiety they bring up in the organization, what have you. And so the book has some practical advice about how to avoid being scapegoated yourself. And just like the other advice in the book, it's about being mindful, making sure that you're delivering your message, even if you're, no matter who or what you're challenging, that you do it in a mindful way, that you consider the timing carefully, that you not embarrass anybody. And if it turns out the emperor is wearing no clothes, maybe you can send the emperor an anonymous email or something rather than calling it out in a meeting. The second chapter is about the nurture of credit and blame. And what this is about how each of us in the course of our lives, as we grow up in our families, we learn about credit and blame from our families, from our parents, from our siblings. We learn what's praiseworthy, we learn what's blameworthy, we learn about fairness, we learn about unfairness, we learn about favoritism. Sometimes in families, some kids can do no wrong, they're the golden child. Sometimes kids can do no right, they're the black sheep of the family, if you will. And so this gets played out in the workplace. So the book also talks about the notion of transference, which is that we tend to reenact family dynamics in the workplace. So a boss becomes a pseudo-parent, and a coworker becomes a pseudo-sibling. Nepotism, if you will. So it's nepotism not of the demographic, literal sense, but of the psychological sense. There's something that's known as homosocial reproduction, which is that we tend to select people and to affiliate with people who are similar to ourselves, to reproduce ourselves in that social manner, and not necessarily people who are similar to us in a demographic way, but people who are similar to us in terms of other attributes that they have. It could be in terms of values, it could be in terms of education, or other things like that. And so learning about transference, I'm not suggesting that everybody be on the couch and do psychoanalysis for 15 years, but still reflecting on those things about how you're caring about credit and blame, how your identity is wrapped up in what you're doing for better or for worse, can be very important. And often I find with my clients that in order for them to understand what's happening for them in their careers, it's very important that they understand their buttons and which buttons are being pushed. So I tell this story in the book of a man, a financial services executive, who was assigned a coach because human resources said this guy has no people skills. He has no managerial skills. And when I first met with him, I inquired what had happened. And he said that there was a merger. He never really wanted to have a staff. As a result of the merger, he was given several direct reports, some of them in Europe. And there was a woman who kept calling him and bothering him, asking him questions. And once he got so fed up that he hung up on her. He blamed her for annoying him, for interrupting his work, and he hung up on her. And in this particular financial services organization, like in most other organizations, at least is the way it should be, hanging up on someone is not an acceptable way of handling a workplace conflict, especially when it's somebody who reports to you. You're not setting a very good leadership example. So in our first coaching meeting, I asked him, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I think it is important to understand someone's story. How did they get to be who they are? So I asked him, tell me about any early life experiences that you think influenced how you come across in the workplace. And the first story he told was, he said, I grew up in an immigrant family. I was the only kid out of 5 siblings who had any academic talent or interest. I didn't have my own room, so I would do my homework in the dining room on the table, and my siblings would always sort of be raucous and be annoying. And then at the end of the day, after they were playing and I was finished with my homework, my sister would come and demand that I help her with her homework. And we were both like, I mean, it didn't require my interpretation. It was so immediately apparent to both of us immediately that, he was having kind of a flashback, that this direct report asking him that question was just like being bothered by his younger sister. So how he reacted, he blamed her unduly because of this transference flashback kind of reaction he was having, and in turn got himself in so much more trouble with the rest of the organization because he was acting out in an immediate, impulsive way. So knowing your own story, knowing what's pushing your buttons, knowing your script, and making sure that you're not reenacting that can be very important. I also talk in the book about several other things. Michelle Conlin wrote an article in Business Week in 2004 called "I'm a Bad Boss, Blame My Dad." Dad, if you're watching, I don't blame you. About how people act out in the workplace. And it tells one story of an executive who actually worked at Microsoft who got in trouble with his supervisors because he felt like they were criticizing him. He had a flashback to his parents criticizing him as a teenager, and it became quite problematic for him. There's also in the book a write-up of an article in which some clients of mine appeared in the New York Times in 2008, 3 women from an advertising agency called Tag Creative, where in the process of working with the 3 of them and helping them with conflict resolution, they each came to own that they were acting with each other like sisters. And they, 2 of them had sisters, 1 of them didn't, but they were acting and reacting to each other in a way that had nothing to do with the moment at hand, but instead was kind of a flashback from earlier in life. So when it comes to credit and blame and the emotions surrounding credit and blame, knowing your story, and to the extent you can, trying to know without asking all kinds of intrusive questions that violate laws about people's early life experiences, just trying to get a sense of what their story is can be quite helpful. Any questions about that, about the nurture aspects of blame? Yes? You mean like people who are only children? In my experience, only children are different. I mean, and there's always exceptions to rules, and sometimes people grew up with cousins, and et cetera, et cetera. But on my website, on dattnerconsulting.com, there's actually a link to a PowerPoint presentation that I did about birth order with leaders. And there are some very well-known leaders, for example, Jack Welch from GE, who are only children. They tend to be very academically successful, very comfortable with authority and control. They may have a tougher time working on a team. So all of these things, depend on a lot of different factors, but there are somewhat consistent patterns. And it may be, sometimes I've had clients who are only children who are working on teams, and they don't blame themselves, or they don't blame their parents for not having more kids, but they say, I'm an only child, so I find this sort of collaborative, depending on other people and being so interdependent on them, I find it particularly hard. That's one of the things in the book also, which is that knowing yourself should never be used as a rationalization. It should never be, of course I'm having a hard time collaborating on the team. I'm an only child. Instead it should be, I might have a harder time because I'm an only child, but how do I then work around that? Okay. So the next chapter is called Typecasting Blame. And what that's about is about personality, both normal and dysfunctional, and how that relates to credit and blame. On the book's website, which is creditandblame.com, there's a link to the Harvard Business Review article, which is in this month's Harvard Business Review, the April 2011 failure issue. In there, there's a link to a free test, the IPIP 120. You can Google it, which is a free Big 5 personality test, which will, for free, give you a report. You answer 120 questions, and it will tell you where you fall on the Big 5 dimensions, which are?
Conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, openness to experience, can I say that one? Neuroticism.
Canoe. Kudos to Brian for remembering stuff from grad school. So depending on where you fall on conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion, there are those dimensions, and then there are also sub-factors. So for example, one of the sub-factors of conscientiousness is achievement striving. If you're high on achievement striving, you're going to care a lot about getting credit for things and want to make breakthrough contributions. One of the sub-factors of neuroticism is anger. You can be angry. You can have anger within you that comes out in the workplace. And if you're high on the anger sub-factor of neuroticism, you might get extremely disproportionately angry if you feel unduly blamed or insufficiently credited. So the next part of that chapter is about the dysfunctional personality types. The ocean or canoe, Big Five, is about normal personality, but it's also important to keep in mind that you might be displaying some of the attributes of dysfunctional personality types. And these dysfunctional personality types fall into three broad categories. They're extra punitive, where you blame other people too harshly; impunitive, where you either deny blame or you deny your own role in the blame; or intrapunitive, where you blame yourself too much. And each one of these can be problematic. Men tend to be more extrapunitive or impunitive, and women tend to be more intrapunitive. And there's a variety of sociological and cultural reasons that that's the case, but women tend to have a harder time taking credit. They tend to underestimate how much credit they're getting from other people. And men, if they're displaying these dysfunctional personality types, tend to be more blaming of others. So when it comes to these categories, extra punitive, there's the excitable, volatile guardian. And all these are listed in the book, and as well as in the Harvard Business Review article. So a volatile guardian overreacts to minor mistakes, determines failure prematurely, assigns blame unfairly, and reacts defensively to feedback. So if somebody is extra punitive, they can be very hard to work with, they can be very hard to work for, and although this might protect their self-esteem and give them righteous anger and righteous rage instead of self-criticizing depression, they can be, have a really hard time learning over time. Impunitive, which is denying blame, the big person on campus, is someone who it's good to steer clear of. This is someone who becomes angry or hurt when blamed, who will ingratiate with superiors and distort information in order to avoid blame. So as I was walking here this morning, I thought about Google's slogan, which is "Don't be evil." So part of it is don't be evil when it comes to credit and blame. But I think no less important, it's also don't assume evil. Don't look for evil where there may not be evil in your coworkers, or don't look for failure, don't look for underperformance. One of the consistent themes in the book is about how helpful it is to give people the benefit of the doubt. That if you look for blame, if you look for failure, you're more likely to find it. If you look for success, if you look for credit, you're more likely to find that. So it's self-fulfilling for better or for worse. Intrapunitive, so a martyr would be an example of somebody who had a dysfunctional approach to the workplace. This is someone who might accept more blame than she deserves in order to preserve working relationships, or to blame herself so harshly that it deflects other people's criticism. So what can you do about this? On the book's website, on creditandblame.com, there's an assessment that you can take that I developed and market in partnership with performance programs. And you can see how you fall on these 11 different dysfunctional types, whether you're likely to be perceived as displaying these types. And if you're working with a mentor or an executive coach, or even with a trusted colleague or peer, you can say, how am I coming across? Am I handling credit and blame? Am I reacting to it in a good way? Am I assigning it in a good way? As I progress in my career, how can I do a better job of managing the delicate balance for myself and for others of credit and blame? Any questions about that before I move on to the next chapter? Okay, so the next one is situational awareness, which is there's the people and there's the situation. And in grad school, we suffered through many conversations, discussions, and debates about is it the person, is it the situation, or is it both? And so when it comes to workplace relationships, when it comes to teams, there's a lot of social influences that determine how we assign credit and blame, how we react to credit and blame. And the analogy that I use in the book is it's a little bit like water. Water can change phase depending on the ambient environment. So water can be ice, water can be water, or water can be steam. And the same is true of people and their personalities, which is we can be the equivalent of water, steam, and ice. And so some people may not be extra punitive until they're under a certain kind of stress, and then they can act out. Or people may not be intra-punitive under normal circumstances, but then if things go wrong, if they're blamed by other people, it can push buttons, it can bring up early memories or what have you. So if you're trying to figure yourself out, if you're trying to figure others out, there's something known as the fundamental attribution error in organizational psychology and psychology more broadly, where we over-attribute to people's character or to their dispositions, and we underestimate the importance of the situation. But when it comes to credit and blame, it's important to not only think about someone's traits, but also to think about their states. What kind of state are they in? If they're under a certain kind of stress, they may act out and react in a dysfunctional way. We may conclude that's just the kind of person they are, but what all kinds of research in organizational psychology shows is that situations in the workplace can be powerful. Situations can attenuate differences between people. So even though I might be extroverted, you may be introverted, if we're both working in sales, we both have to be extroverted if we're going to be successful. And similarly, just like situations can make the different people act the same, it can make the same people act different. I might be one way in one situation and another way in another situation. So it's important in the workplace to think about these influences and to think about what kind of environment are you going to be most comfortable and successful in, and where are you likely to face challenges. Organizational cultures. This is chapter 5. That's another kind of situational contextual influence on how we act and react in terms of credit and blame. And some cultures are open, and people are willing to question their own role in credit and blame and to think about the contextual factors, etc. Unfortunately, too many organizations have scapegoats, search for the guilty, punishment of the innocent, as I mentioned before. So what great leaders do, which is the next chapter, regardless of where they are in their careers or what level they are at an organizational level, is they think about credit and blame and how do you set a positive example rather than a negative example. There's a seminal article from the 70s, Stephen Kerr, on the folly of rewarding A while hoping for B. And what great organizational cultures do is they think, what are we implicitly or explicitly crediting or blaming? And are we crediting or blaming the right thing at the right time? I have had clients who have said, you know, we want to sell higher margin products. And all the salespeople say, we're still compensated based on volume. And so if an organizational culture doesn't recognize that it's sending mixed messages and rewarding the wrong things, it's unlikely that it's going to change. So chapter 6 is about leaders, great leaders at different levels of organizations and what they do. So one example I tell in the story is of Wernher von Braun during the 1960s. Even though he was controversial for his role in the Nazi rocket program, he was still a widely admired leader of the US space program. And one day there was a rocket that blew up at launch. And an engineer came into von Braun's office and sheepishly admitted that he had touched a circuit board right before launch, and that's why the rocket had blown up. The engineer came into work the next day expecting to find a pink slip on his desk, but instead there was a bottle of champagne from von Braun himself with a note that said, "Thank you for confessing your error. You saved us months of diagnostic work, and we may have never even found out what had gone wrong with the rocket." So that's what great leaders do. Amy Edmondson at Harvard has said that what great leaders do is they create an environment that's safe, where people feel safe admitting mistakes and being self-critical, but not necessarily comfortable. Not an environment where everybody feels, you know, so at ease that they don't worry about making mistakes. They still are committed, you know, they still feel bad about making mistakes, but paradoxically, leaders who encourage blame, who encourage people to share blame, create better environments. In the organizational culture chapter, I also talk about Amy Edmondson's work about hospitals, where she found, this is another counterintuitive paradoxical result, that it's actually better to go to a hospital, certain hospitals at least, with higher error rates rather than lower error rates, higher surgical mistakes, higher drug administration errors. And you might say, why would I want to go to a hospital with a higher error rate? The reason is because those hospitals are better on every other metric, than other than these error rates, and the reason is because they actually confess their errors, and because they confess them, they are able to fix them. In the hospitals, the comparison hospitals, where they didn't admit their mistakes, where they had lower error rates, the errors were happening. They were probably even happening at a higher rate than the hospitals with that reported the higher error rates, but people didn't actually convey them or admit them, and therefore the underlying things couldn't be fixed. Any questions? So what great leaders do, Michael Dell is an example of this, is they are open to feedback. Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, said what great leaders do is they look in the mirror when things go wrong to take responsibility, and out the window when things go right. And so what great leaders do is they accept feedback, they take on blame, they take a customer-focused continuous improvement view, and when they do that, they set an example for people in the rest of the organization to also take blame, to not deny blame. To some extent, what this whole book is about is it's really about evolution. It's about individual, team, and organizational evolution. So credit and blame are kind of just a proxy for pride, spite, shame, and all these other things that can either, if you manage them correctly, help propel you forward in your career, or if you're stuck because of, you're too much about pride and too ashamed to admit mistakes, or you're too afraid of the shame or embarrassment of making a mistake to never experiment with something new, if you don't risk failure, it's unlikely that you'll be able to make breakthrough contributions or to make progress over the course of your career. Questions about that before I move on to the final chapter? Okay, so there are two parts to the final chapter, which is about practical approaches for yourself as an individual in your career, and also as a leader of others in an organization. So the first one is take a step back. Don't act impulsively. I talk about this in the book and also in the Harvard Business Review article, which is you can't always make things better when it comes to credit and blame if you've been insufficiently credited or unduly blamed, but you can always make things worse. Each of us has the capability to make things worse by acting out in a rigid way, by blaming other people, by denying it, by being a prima donna, by being a drama queen, by doing whatever it is that you do. If you're acting out in a self-destructive, impulsive way, I guarantee you, everybody here has the power to make things worse. Being strategic is also important. Think about, what is this really worth to me? Am I winning the battle but losing the war? And think about credit and blame, how you're managing it. And it's never a good idea to blame people too much, but it can be a good idea to share a little bit more credit than you believe others deserve, because it's like the perceptual thing where you have two lines, those famous perception studies, and one of them looks longer just because of the context and perspective, one of them looks shorter. The same is true when it comes to credit and blame, which is we perceive that we deserve more credit, we perceive that others deserve less credit, so it's good to sort of correct for those errors and biases. Understand your own story. So again, you don't have to do 15 years of psychoanalysis, but knowing your story and what motivates you and what's your identity and how is that related to work and how you come across and how you're credited and blamed and how does that propel your success, but also how does that hold you back. So what is your story and what are other people's stories, and then how do you intervene, how do you make changes and tweaks on an ongoing basis to change that story. Know your type and your risk factors. So even if you take the credit and blame type assessment and it tells you you're a big person on campus or you're a martyr, you may still question it. You might not fully come to terms with it, and that's okay, but you might be perceived that way. So forget about, for the moment, the reality of whether you actually are or aren't, but it's like if you're coming across as taking too much credit, how can you come across in a more modest, more collaborative way? Fight the fundamental attribution error, so try to look at the context, and Google and Brian and his people help you do that by saying, keep the context in mind. There were contextual factors that made things easier or harder for this person, and make sure you're keeping in mind biases, the recency effect, the primacy effect, etc. Start with positive expectations. So again, as I mentioned before, giving people the benefit of the doubt, looking for credit rather than blame, will be self-fulfilling. Any questions about those? Please.
What's the most common blame type?
The research actually did not look at that. What we found was that 70% of the population falls into one of those dysfunctional types, but I didn't actually see the statistics about which one was more common. That would be a good question for Robert Hogan, for Hogan Assessment Systems. Okay, so practical approaches for leaders. Be a blame-savvy boss. So think about credit and blame, the dynamics of credit and blame on your team, and be mindful of how you're assigning it, how other people are assigning it. Take an open and adaptive approach rather than blaming people. Think about how can we focus on solutions rather than on problems, realizing that you're setting an example with everything you do or don't do. Fight groupthink, so try to think about, it's going to be tempting for people who report to you to become yes men and women and tell you everything you're doing is great. So you have to keep in mind that sort of social hierarchy and people's intimidation and ask people questions like, well, if this doesn't work, why wouldn't it work? Or maybe you assign people randomly to argue for or against an initiative or a project that you're considering, just so there's a forum for that, so people will feel, again, safe to speak up even if they don't feel comfortable. Focus on systems and situations. So think about when you're talking with people about their performance and what made it go well or didn't go well, what are the contextual factors and how can you as a leader get them more resources or support or information so that they can be more successful going forward. Get and keep the right people on the bus. So when you're hiring people, try to ascertain how do they do in terms of credit and blame. Are they unduly crediting themselves? Are they saying I when they really mean we? Or maybe they're too modest and self-effacing and they're saying we when they really mean I. But looking at people's pattern of credit and blame can be a great diagnostic as to whether they'll be a good person to have reporting to you or to have working with you. And the last recommendation is to write a managerial user's manual for your new team. And what this is it's a document. It can be informal. You can share it in writing or just verbally, which is, I'm your new boss. Here's what you need to know about me. Here's what people are likely to misunderstand about me. And the reason this is relevant to credit and blame is because people size each other up. There can be cross-cultural miscommunications. So if I'm your new boss and I ask you a lot of questions, you might panic and you might assume that I don't trust you, that I'm trying to get rid of you. I'm asking a lot of questions and you might get worried that this is really about me determining who to fire. But if I say to you, it's my style to ask a lot of questions. It doesn't mean that I don't trust you. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to diagnose your capabilities. I just ask a lot of questions. Or I have one client who wrote a managerial user's manual where she told her team, I'm British, so I tend to be reserved, and Americans tend to think I'm standoffish and aloof, but I'm not. I'm just British, so come talk to me anytime. And there are other things like that where people might say, for example, I like information even if it's unfinalized, so don't wait until the last minute. Give me updates. I like updates. Give me an update even if the update is there's no update. And that way, there doesn't have to be tension because you're not giving the manager what he or she wants. So having this thing can avoid misunderstandings and what I call in the book mondegreens, which are when things are misunderstood. And two famous stories about that was Winston Churchill during the Second World War was referring to a person and he said to his staff, bring me Berlin, not the city, the person. So they bring this man to his office and Winston Churchill says to him, so what's the latest thing you've been working on? And the guy says, a song called White Christmas. And in fact, Churchill had wanted them to bring him Isaiah Berlin, the great philosopher, but they brought him Irving Berlin. And there's another story about Herbert Hoover, who had a rigid rule that there had to be 1-inch margins on every memo that was sent to him. And some hapless FBI leader sent him some note and where he proposed something, but there was a lot of information, so the margins were thinner. And so Hoover said, your plan is fine, but watch the borders. And what he meant was watch the borders of your memo, but instead they panicked and they sent FBI agents to the Rio Grande and to Saskatchewan or whatever to watch the borders because they thought he meant watch the borders of the United States. So as a leader, if people are intimidated by you, if you're blaming, you paradoxically are less likely to get what you want because people aren't going to approach you and ask for clarification. They're going to instead bring you the wrong person and engage in the wrong task-based behavior. And so a user's manual breaks the ice and makes sure that people feel comfortable approaching you and that there aren't those cascading misunderstandings of blame that then lead to poor results. Because there was a woman who wrote a book where she heard this song about Earl Murray and they laid him on the green, but she misinterpreted that as Earl Murray and they lady Mondegreen. So she wrote this book, which is referenced in the book, where she talked about Mondegreens. You know, like, excuse me while I kiss this guy, or the girl with colitis goes by, or things like that.
I said they could build a reality show.
Yes, that would be great. Great, so any questions or comments? Please.
At the very beginning you said, talk about evolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
We come to the quote where more about some of the species having similar behavior. How does that tie evolution?
Yeah, so the question was, how does the example of Coco the gorilla and the capuchin monkeys relate to evolution? It could just be a snapshot in time. Because I believe that what the research has shown is that we are hardwired. For example, stereotyping is something that was an evolutionary benefit to determine, is this person friend or foe? So the capuchin monkeys, I also talk in that chapter about bats, where there are vampire bats that go out and suck the blood of large mammals. And then they have this sort of bat blood co-op where they regurgitate blood into each other's mouths. If one bat gets lucky one night and gets prey and the other one doesn't, they will actually regurgitate blood and share with each other and then keep track of who was stingy and who wasn't stingy. So these bats have among the largest cerebral cortexes in the mammalian world because of these reciprocal things. So then you can say, okay, well, these bats have these reciprocal notions and a sort of prototype of credit and blame. So then how does that relate to human evolution and our big cortexes and our reciprocal keeping track of social relationships? So it's not to say that we evolved from bats or even from capuchin monkeys, but what's supposed to say is that, you know, we're not the only animals that have notions of credit and blame and that are able to point the finger, that care about fairness, that track reciprocity, or that are able to blame others. You know, so this is something that is likely, you know, it's always hard to verify any kind of evolutionary psychology hypotheses because you can't really do an experiment to test, you know, let's have people evolve without pointing fingers or what have you, but, you know, it's sort of argument by analogy. Any questions from our YouTube viewers? No? Okay.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. I'll be here if anybody wants a book signed.